Controversial decisions in the UFC are nothing new, which is why it's hard to keep track of them. But fret not, because from bad calls to get the crowd angry to bad scoring systems, I've brought you a list of the most controversial decisions in UFC history. Starting with UFC 119, where Sean Sherk fought Evan Dunham.
Dunham trying to open up with the hands a bit.
Those are good tight punches inside by Sherk though.
There have probably been worse decisions in the short history of the UFC, but when Sean Sherk beat Evan Dunham at UFC 119, the crowd was especially angry. Most of the time, they both put on an interesting contest, but almost all of the high points were due to Dunham.
Second round was close, third round I would give that to Dunham, so it just depends.
When he got some space, the 28-year-old put together a lot of impressive combinations that hurt his opponent more than once. The judges' high marks for Shrek's wrestling may be the strangest thing about this fight. Except for an elbow that cut Dunham open in the first round, the former lightweight champion didn't do much except hold his opponent against the cage and block a series of tight chokes. The fact that Sherk's interview after the fight was drowned out by boos from the live crowd said a lot.
So, I don't know why they were booing me, and we went out there and we threw down. And
some decisions are a little controversial because no one can agree on them, and I get it. Michael Bisping's win over Matt Hamill at UFC 75 in London, for example, is seen as a bad case of hometown judging. But after watching the fight again recently, I think the decision makes more sense than it did the first time I saw it. Who really deserved to win depends on how they did in rounds 2 and 3. Hamill won the first round since he came out like a madman and beat Bisping for 5 minutes. The second fight was a lot closer. Hamill slowed down, and Bisping got his bike and scored points from the outside. It was especially hard to judge the final round. Positionally, Hamill was in charge for most of the round. He took the Brit down and kept him on his back for a large part of the last frame. But Bisping did a lot of damage on the ground as Hamill's hands dropped because he was tired. Even though it was the Count's backyard, the live crowd booed when the decision was read. It was a very close fight that could have gone either way, but I thought Bisping won the second time I watched it. Then there's the time that a fight was just scored really weirdly. At UFC Fight Night 2, when Demetrius Johnson fought Ian McCall, there was a huge mistake. This was the first flyweight fight in UFC history and part of a 4-man tournament to find the first 255-pound champion. The fight was controversial, but not because the judge made a bad call. The fight could have been scored for either man. It was caused by a huge mistake in counting that was later fixed. At first, Johnson was given a majority decision, but officials discovered that the fight should have been called a draw. Since the competition was part of a tournament, there was a sudden victory round in case the judges couldn't decide who won after 3 rounds.
Get those takedowns going in that second round.
Because the officials couldn't do simple math, there wasn't a 4th round of a fight that was already very interesting. This delayed the end of the tournament by several months. Of course, some fights are a little confusing too though, like when Carlos Condit and Nick Diaz fought for the interim welterweight title. There isn't much more to say about this fight. The California native's devoted fans ensured that the decision would be one of the most controversial in UFC history.
To great degrees. They turn on the end of their punches as well as anybody.
How you rated the fight probably depends on how important you thought aggression was. Diaz pushed the fight for 5 rounds, while Condit did most of his damage when he was on his back. Condit hit Diaz more than Diaz, but it's still unclear which hits were more effective.
Oh, very nice.
Anyone who doesn't like Condit says he just fought for points and didn't do much damage to Diaz. He claimed that he and Greg Jackson apparently came up with a great game plan and did a great job of sticking to it for 25 minutes. This next fight was clearly favoring one fighter, but the judge chose to favor the other. The lightweight title fight between BJ Penn and Frankie Edgar at UFC 112 was expected to be a blowout. Edgar was too small to be a real threat to Penn's crowd. Up until that point, he had looked solid, but nothing special. That's why you can imagine why it came as a real shock to me when things didn't work out that way.
Before, Joe, Utilize what he hopes is a speed advantage.
The one thing about
All of the rounds were very close. Penn followed Edgar and landed the harder shots while Edgar dodged in and out of range and scored with combinations. Many people thought Edgar was just playing for points against Penn, who was more aggressive. One judge gave every round to Edgar, which was probably the most controversial thing about the fight. Of course, some fights were really good, so when they didn't get a fair decision, people got pissed. Randy Couture versus Pedro Rizzo at UFC 31 is considered one of the best championship fights in UFC history, but it also tends to spark much debate, which may be just as interesting. From what little research I've done, it's interesting that many fans didn't think the fight was very close. People tend to look at it in one of two strange ways. Aside from rounds 1 and 2, which were clearly a tie, how you score the fight depends on your own preferences. I saw the fight for the natural. Like many other fans, I had no doubts about who won the fight. I gave Couture rounds 1, 3, and 4. Feel free to share your own ideas in the comments. I'm especially interested in how other people rated this fight. Some fights are really famous though, because people just keep debating over the decisions made during them. Like the time at UFC 20 when Bas Rutten and Kevin Randleman had a heavyweight title fight. It's talked about because of how it was scored. People still argue about how to balance positional dominance and offense. If you think about judging conventionally, then the fighter on top is the winner. At the end of the fight in question, the way points were given was different, but the basic idea was the same. This time though, it wasn't. The judges gave the fight to Rutten because he could hit Randleman well from the bottom, even though he spent most of the fight on his back. Many people liked the decision because it punished Randleman for not doing anything while he was on his opponent's guard. Even though I tend to agree with those who say that wrestling's given too much weight in MMA, I think Randleman did enough to earn the decision. Not all decisions are clear-cut and controversial though. Some are actually pretty confusing down to the end. Nam Phan versus Leonard Garcia was the final match of the TUF 12. Unlike many of the other fights I talked about, the judging of Nam Phan and Leonard Garcia's match at the Ultimate Fighter 12 finale is a real mystery. Garcia might not have won a single round, but he still got the decision. One can only think that the judges gave him points for effort because they liked how he fought. Nam Phan completely beat his opponent in both hits and holds for most of the fight. In fact, Garcia spent most of the fight swinging wildly and resting his hands on his hips because he was so tired. Even seeing the video repeatedly doesn't help explain why Garcia got the decision. That's all the most controversial decisions in UFC history. See you in the next one.
To great degrees. They turn on the end of their punches as well as anybody.